this is a time to be in action. This is a time to know what you believe and to be teaching it, to be spreading it. This is a time to be salt of the earth. This is the time to be the light of the world, to be witnesses throughout Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. Acts chapter 1, verse 8. This is the time for boldness. This is it. It's a greater opportunity for the spread of the gospel, for Christian living than I have seen in my lifetime. And I don't know how much longer this opportunity lasts, but I know this. I know our job is to make the most of every opportunity, right? So that's what we're doing. That's what we're looking at here, Acts chapter 14. Start in verse 8, all right? Verse 8 says they're in a city called Lystra. They're in modern-day Turkey. It's sometimes called Asia Minor. It's also called Galatia, which is a region there. And the book of Galatians in your New Testament is written to these churches in this area. Okay, so at Lystra, Acts chapter 14, verse 8, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. He listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him, seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. And when the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian, "The gods have come down on us in the likeness of men." Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul they called Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. This is crazy. We'll stop here for a minute. We'll carry on from there. Paul and Barnabas have at this point been to several different cities that the book of Acts gives mention to. They encountered all kinds of different stuff going on in these different locations, okay? They typically encounter resistance from people of Jewish descent who are not interested in the gospel. There's always a bunch of Jews who accept Christ, and there's always a bunch who reject him, okay? They had a guy named Sergius Paulus, who was a proconsul who had a bad kind of advisor whose name was Elymas, who was no good, and then he taught kind of falsehoods. But here in Lystra, they're dealing with something new that they have not directly faced yet, which is people who worship Zeus and Hermes and stuff, who actually believe in Zeus and Hermes, not just as mythology or just stories or something, but actually believe in him and have a temple to him and have a priest, and they want to offer sacrifices. And when they see Paul and Barnabas, they think this must be Zeus and Hermes in the flesh. I mean, that's what they actually believe. It's kind of crazy to you and I, but these people believed it. And so Paul and Barnabas have never dealt with this before, and this chapter we're going to see how they deal with it. Okay? The priest of Zeus, verse 13, I'll start here, whose temple was at the entrance to the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice to the crowds. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news, that you should turn away from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that's in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness, for he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." And even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. Okay, so a couple interesting things to note here. I already noted, these people actually are worshiping Paul and Barnabas, worshiping them. They want to offer sacrifices to them. They're not saying, "Hey, thank you for healing that guy." They're not saying, "Wow, this is amazing." They're not calling them prophets or healers from God or something. They actually think that these are gods themselves. Crazy, right? But they think it. And so Paul and Barnabas have to deal with this. Now, right off the bat, if they were the wrong kind of preacher, if they were in this for money, fame, influence, whatever, they would have accepted it. They would have said, "Whoa, let's just hang out in Lystra for a while. They actually worship us here. They tried to stone us to death in the last town. They ran us out of town. They threatened us to put us in jail. This town's worshiping us. Let's just hang here for a bit. This is pretty cool." They're not that kind of preacher. They're preachers of the true gospel. They know that they are accountable to God himself. They aren't going to believe for a minute that they are gods. They're not going to entertain that. So they go running out there, shouting and yelling and saying, why are you guys doing this? But listen, they're in Lystra, and it doesn't appear that there's a synagogue here. They're not talking to Jewish people. They're not talking to people at this point with a background in their Old Testament, which Paul was an expert in. Okay? They're not talking to those people. They're talking to people with this Greek God mythology thing going on. And so when they explain what's going on, they don't use any of their Old Testament language. Okay? And they say, the God who made heaven and earth and sea and all that's in them. Okay, they're talking about creation. They're not talking about 10 Commandments and Moses and David and prophets and stuff, because they know the people they're talking to never even heard of that stuff. Okay, in past generations, he allowed all nations to walk in their own ways. Meaning you guys, you've walked in your own ways. You've done your own thing. You worship Zeus and build a temple about him and stuff. Good. Okay, that in the past. Yet, verse 17, he did not leave himself without witness. He did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness. So they're showing them, this is called general revelation. Just that God exists by looking around at creation. At the world around us, you can kind of tell God exists and God is good. So they're trying to reach them on that level because that's the level they're going to understand. Okay. Now, big picture here in terms of what this chunk of verses is about. As I read it, and I look at my own life and your life and just where we're at and what we need to be doing, the people of this world, all of us, are going to listen to somebody. They're going to listen. Okay, verse 8. At Lystra, there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. He was crippled from birth and had never walked. Verse 9, he listened to Paul speaking. He's listening. Who's he listening to? He's listening to the guy who's talking, which is Paul in this case. Paul looks intently at him. They make a connection. Okay, now I'm going to talk directly to you. He says in a loud voice, says this, stand upright. Okay, and the guy's healed, and it's amazing. But then all the people come running because now a miracle has happened. And they're listening to their entire childhood and everything they've ever been taught to believe is that Zeus is God and Hermes is like a spokesperson for God, and that's what they believe. Why do they believe it? Because it's what they were taught. They listened to people teach it. Who did they listen to? Specifically, they listened to the priest of Zeus. Verse 13, the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. He's the spiritual leader of this town. He's a bad leader. He's leading them into falsehood about Zeus. They seem to genuinely believe it. Their faith in Zeus appears to be pretty sincere, like they're rejoicing. That's better than you could say for the people of Jerusalem and Galilee when Jesus came. Their love for God, the God of heaven, when his son comes to earth, they didn't come running to him rejoicing. Well, I guess you could say a lot of them did in the crowds, but there were also crowds that shouted, crucify him, and then did. So these people in Lystra are sincere. Like they sincerely believe in Zeus. Crazy to me, crazy to you, but they believe. Why do they believe? They believe because they were taught about Zeus probably from childhood on up. That's who God is. His name is Zeus, and he's this and that, and all these what we call Greek mythology stories. They would have probably believed them. They built a temple to him. They hired a priest, and they offered sacrifices to him. I mean, they believed as sincerely in Zeus as by reading this, the way I read it, they just believed very sincerely in Zeus, and they're just sincerely wrong. Okay, and Paul says this. So when Barnabas and Paul heard it, verse 14, they tore their garments and rushed out in the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things?" Like, listen to us. People are going to listen to something. You're going to learn. Your kids are going to be educated one way or another. You are going to form opinions one way or another. We tend, especially the older we get, we tend to go looking for people who say things that we already like to believe. And so we listen to them because we like what they say, because it somehow strikes a chord in what we already believe. And we surround ourselves with people who teach things that we like. That's just what happens. That's one of the main reasons why we have such horrible division in this country right now, and that's why you can't talk to certain people about certain subjects because they'll get mad, or you'll get mad at them, or both, or whatever. That's why people aren't inviting their family members to Thanksgiving anymore, because they're so divided they don't even want to hear other opinions. Paul and Barnabas know this, and they run into the crowd, shouting, crying out loudly. They've got to teach the truth here, because these people are listening to something, and it has to be the gospel. If it's not the gospel, it'll be something else. All right? That's where we're at right now. Your neighbor, your coworker, your in-laws, your cousins, your mom, your dad, your kids, your whoever, are going to listen to somebody. They're going to listen. Nobody lives in a vacuum. Nobody just lives their life doing their own thing without any regard or semblance of idea what's going on. They listen to somebody. The guy who was crippled was listening to Paul, and Paul was speaking. What if Paul hadn't been speaking? The guy would not have been listening to him. What if Paul and Barnabas had allowed the crazy Zeus worship to just go on without interrupting it, without speaking any truth? Then it would have gone on without interruption, and the people would have continued to not know the truth. So there's people in your life who need to know the truth, and they're going to get their idea of truth somewhere, even if the thing that they believe is something kind of crazy, like Zeus. They'll believe it because it's what they hear, it's what they're taught, and they have an expert. In this case, they had a priest, but you can always find an expert to say anything you want. Experts, that's the crazy thing about them. You can find a scientist who says wear the mask. You can find one who says don't wear the mask. You can find an expert that will say anything. It's kind of ridiculous. We put so much trust in our experts in this country. Somebody gets a PhD behind their name, or somebody does something impressive, and now everybody just listens to everything they say. It's kind of weird. It's not necessarily good or bad. Some of these experts really are experts, whatever. But people listen. They listen to voices that they hear. What voice are they going to hear? They can hear the gospel, or are they just going to hear some other stuff? We have to be faithful. We have to be out there actually teaching the gospel. Let your life look like the gospel, but it's got to come out your mouth too. And that might scare you. That might not be easy for you. But they're going to listen to somebody whose mouth is open talking. They're going to hear it. Let's make sure they're hearing about Jesus. Let's make sure we're living faithful to Jesus. If Paul and Barnabas did all this healing and spoke the truth, and then when the falsehoods about Zeus came out and they just kind of accepted it, well, then it would have diluted and washed out the actual gospel truth that they were there to spread. The gospel is news. It's not a church. It's not a ministry. It's nothing. It's not a thing. The gospel is news. It is good news, and news is supposed to travel, and news is supposed to be talked about, and it is facts. It's not fake news. People are going to listen to some news. They're going to listen to it somewhere or other. Let's make sure they're listening to the good news. Let's make sure we're spreading the good news, whether we feel like we have perfect answers or not. Paul and Barnabas are way out of their depth. They're not. Paul is like an expert Jew. That's what he's a Pharisee, memorized like his Old Testament stuff. He's an expert Jew. Barnabas, we don't really know. He's from Cyprus. Like, it's hard to say exactly what his expertise is, other than he just loves Jesus and loves to take care of God's people. But they're out of their depth. They're not talking to people with the same background as them. And yet they're not afraid to run right into the crowd, crying out to teach the truth as best they can. And it says, even with these words, verse 18, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifices to them. Like, they just barely stopped them from sacrificing to them. Okay? They didn't convert 1 million people on the spot and say, whoa, man, you guys explained it so well. The people just barely avoided sacrificing to them. I mean, Paul and Barnabas aren't perfect. They didn't do a perfect job here, but they did the best they could. They made sure their voice was heard, because somebody has to hear it, because they're going to hear something, all right? That's where we're at right now. Our culture needs to hear the gospel. The TVs are always on. There's 1,000 TV channels. There's 1,000 news networks spreading all kinds of news. There's 1,000 opinions, man. Go on Facebook or something and just scroll through that nonsense. Everybody's got an opinion. Everybody is making their voice heard. Let's make sure the gospel voice is heard. Praise the Lord, guys. That's where we're at. We'll carry on and do some more of chapter 14 here.